American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 11, Political Participation and Voting Behavior. In this segment, we'll be considering the sole learning objective of explaining the three theories used to explain voting behavior. So let's take a look at these models of voting behavior. The first one is the sociological model, and this stems from the Columbia School, and we can see this traced back to the 1940s, where we had researchers trying to explain voting choices as consumer choices. However, the researchers found that the voters made up their mind well before the elections occurred, so it wasn't at all like going to a supermarket and choosing from multiple different items. Indeed, it reflected a connection that was already embedded in these people. So the group level characteristics that these people had was seen as playing a major role in voting choice. This included socioeconomic status, which, as we've seen previously, includes education, income, and occupation. It includes religion, a person's ethnicity or race, their sex and gender, and their place of residence. So while this model was started in the 1940s, it has proved to be rather stable over the years, providing us understanding of voting behavior even today. It provides a baseline from which other approaches have been utilized. So when we look at figure 11.4, we see that the voting behavior of these different sociological groups can be seen with their partisanship in the 2004, 2008, and 2012 elections. So that we see that African Americans and Hispanics tend to vote more Democratic as opposed to white people, whereas evangelicals are more likely to vote Republican, as are those in the highest income categories. So we see that this is still a very important approach to understanding voting behavior. Now, another model is that of the rational choice model. This is referred to as the Rochester School. Now, here, voting is seen as the product of a rational cost-benefit analysis. And according to this model, you had fairly precise predictions of what voting behavior would be. Now, the thing is that this model oftentimes is seen as quite circular in its assumptions. It starts out with the assumption that people are rational. And if people vote, voting must be rational. Therefore, people who vote must be rational. So despite this, this has been a very powerful tool over the past 30 or 40 years. However, there are better tools out there for understanding how people vote and why they vote. The next model is that of the social psychological model, and this is the Michigan School. If we look at this graphic here, which comes from the book, we see this funnel of causality, in which case we see the classic Columbia School concepts of region, religion, gender, and socioeconomic status as playing a role. But as you get closer to the vote, as you get more proximate, other factors play a role. And these things are the psychological attachment to a political party, the opinions about candidates, and the views on the issues that are prominent in a particular election. So let's go over each of these in turn. Now first, party identification certainly plays a role, and it's something that we've discussed in great detail in previous lectures. We know that party identification begins in childhood and increases with age, although it can change. But regardless of the change, it's still fairly stable because it is a useful decision rule, in other words, a heuristic. Because if you know a candidate's party, you have a basic idea of what that candidate supports or opposes. As we look at both the slides from the previous clip as well as figure 11.6, we see that the United States is fairly well distributed between Republican and Democrats with their votes for the presidential candidates, and it has remained relatively stable. So that's one thing that we do know, is that the red state, blue state divide has been fairly stable, although if we look even closer, we see that it's not as easy as that there are red states and blue states. There are more likely purple states. Now, issues certainly play a role, and they influence voting decisions when three conditions are made. The first is that the voter is aware that issues exist. This is the most obvious one. You have to know that something is out there before it can affect you. But next step is the issues have to personally concern the voter. They have to have an influence over that person's life. If it's tangible or even if it's intangible, if the person is concerned, then they're more likely to be influenced by that issue. And then finally, the voter has to perceive that one candidate is a better candidate to represent him or her. Now, issue voting can be seen as two different types. The first, retrospective voting, is based upon evaluations on prior performance. So looking at a candidate or looking at a party, which one has done a better job in dealing with this issue. Whereas prospective voting considers how well a candidate may perform once in office. And so you're looking towards the future with prospective voting, and retrospective voting look to the past. And certainly, depending on the issue, different issues might lead to different types of issue voting. Now finally, candidate image plays a major role. Now, with other approaches, it has long been considered irrational. But the thing is, it's not as irrational as people think. But it has certainly increased with the rise of television, which arguably, and actually truthfully, is the way that most of us experience leadership, is face-to-face. The difference is that television provides a technology that puts us virtually face-to-face with the candidates. And we can consider them based upon such factors as their physical appearance, their sense of humor, and their family background. Now, while family background certainly leads to a level of connection based upon your identifying with how they grew up and them potentially understanding who you are and what your values are. The other two are seen as irrational, but very subtly they might be much more rational than either the issues or political party. Physical appearance tells us an awful lot about the health of an individual. It tells us about their leadership abilities, and so it's very much of a gestalt, almost automatic response that people rely upon. Likewise, my research suggests that sense of humor is highly important. And it's highly important because even within short humorous comments, we see that this is an indicator of the intelligence, and the type of humor indicates the type of personality traits that an individual might have. So certainly these things might be considered irrational, might be more rational than we think. So finally, let's take a look at voting behavior and the operation of the American political system. Ultimately, when we look at our political system, it's a dynamic equilibrium, and it's an approach to balance stability and change. Voting provides a means by which there is a normal replacement of leadership and representation. So while we do have change, we do have stability in the system. The question is how does this change and stability occur? And this is referred to as the different types of elections and the patterns of elections. Now, the first one is a maintaining election. And this is when the long-term partisan orientation of an electorate keeps the status quo. Now, a deviating election occurs when long-term forces give way to short-term forces, and the minority party becomes the majority party. The question is, what happens after this deviating election? If there's a reinstating election, this means that the previous majority party comes back to power. But if there's a realigning election, the minority party comes to power or remains there in subsequent elections, becoming the majority party. So with this, we're provided with good insights as to how our political system is operating by looking at the elections themselves, which then come from the voting and political behavior of the general public. So ultimately, one of the things that we can take away from this is that the people matter, and they matter through their actions. Whether it's even such minor actions as voting, they can have an influence on who the legislators are and how they carry on with their duties. So ultimately, what we see is that opinions matter, people matter, and the system matters by providing people a voice. American national government.